Hey guys, Eli here from Nintendo Network 64, here today to review Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity. Let me tell you a story about an 11-year-old Eli. Eli loved Pokémon Mystery Dungeon and literally put hundreds of hours into playing the original games. He enjoyed the incredibly long dungeons, all the Pokémon available, the well-thought-out story, and the legendary boss battles. 5 years later, Eli picked up Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity. Either the game isn't as fun for a 16-year-old as it is for an 11-year-old, or so many features were taken out of the game that it's no longer as fun as it used to be. I hypothesize that it's a combination of both. For those unfamiliar with the Mystery Dungeon gameplay, a player departs into a dungeon with randomly generating floors and a squad of team members. Defeating any Pokemon you encounter, and recruiting if you're on the way, your team must best the dungeon in order to help other Pokemon or progress through the story. Originally, there were hundreds of items and hundreds of Pokemon. This is no longer the case in Gates to Infinity. Unfortunately, for every step that the game takes an improvement, there are literally 2 missteps that are taken. For example, although players are now able to customize their areas, you are able to build new shops and minigame stands, there has been a sharp reduction in both the amount of items available and the number of Pokemon available. Whereas before every Pokemon at the time was recruitable and was in the game, that roster has been greatly cut down to about 150 for Gates to Infinity. In previous games, there were hundreds of items, multiple special items for each individual Pokemon which players could collect. Gates to Infinity probably holds about 1/5, if not less, of the items of the previous games, which I find as a major omission. Even worse is that nearly all the legendary Pokemon have been taken out. In the previous games, every legendary Pokemon was battleable and recruitable. In this game, there are only a select few that can be recruited, and even less that can be battled. Before, boss battles were on an epic scale, with awesome monsters to battle and recruit. This is no longer the case in Gates to Infinity, and as a result, traversing a 25-floor dungeon doesn't have nearly the payoff that it should, and this glaring omission can be the biggest turnoff for many people. The game overall also seems to have been greatly simplified in terms of difficulty and user-friendliness. Dungeons are much shorter than they used to be, and there are only a few select dungeons that surpass the 40-floor barrier. In previous games there were tons of dungeons, many incredibly long, but in this game there are not. For those players looking for truly challenging experiences, they'll have to turn to paid DLC. This is one of those times when I despise DLC, because these dungeons should have obviously been originally included in the game. The game also makes some huge missteps in terms of mission structure. Whereas before players could take multiple missions in a single dungeon and complete 4 at a time, Gates to Infinity requires that players only complete 1 mission at a time, greatly slowing down and artificially extending playtime for players. Even worse is the way that multiplayer functionality is set up. In previous games, when felled in battle, players could seek the aid of an online player to rescue them. This was an awesome feature since I could spend tons of time rescuing others, and if I ever was in need, I would be rescued very quickly. Gates to Infinity omits this mode, instead focusing on Street Pass rescues. Players can store Reviver Seeds for Street Pass, and then distribute them to teams in need when Street Passes occur. Unfortunately, it's hard to find anyone to Street Pass with, let alone someone with the game. This leads to the feature being meaningless. More problems begin popping up with user interface and experience. The text scrolls incredibly slow. I don't even know how to describe the slowness in writing or in speaking. I was dying of boredom when the text was scrolling. Maybe the text speed was sufficient for a 4-year-old, but not anyone else. Even worse is that this text can neither be skipped nor sped up, so players are stuck with it. In terms of user experience, the music is much worse than the previous games. The previous games had emotional music, which supported the great story. Gates to Infinity neither has a good story nor good music for the first half of the game. Towards the second half of the game, the music begins to improve, and the last few tunes that are played are actually pretty good. On the bright side, the game is pretty meaty and took me about 25 hours to beat. For those completionists out there, even more content is available, and players can purchase DLC as well to extend gameplay even farther. The 3D isn't bad either, and adds nice depth to the game. This review may have come across very negative, but I didn't necessarily mean it to be so. I was just so disappointed that developers took out so many of the features that made the previous Mystery Dungeon game so great. The gameplay itself is still solid in the game. As with the others, it's just noticeably lacking many of the features of the previous games in the franchise. Honestly, Gates to Infinity isn't necessarily a bad game, but those interested should maybe look into picking up the previous game, Explorers of the Sky, as it is much more fulfilling and a much deeper game overall. For those completely determined to pick up the game, you may have some fun, but don't say I didn't warn you if you come back disappointed. This game gets a 5.5 out of 10. Please don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. It really helps, and see you guys next time for another review.